When people say Grian should move on, what they usually mean is that they want something new, a new dynamic, a new setting, a fresh start. And that makes sense. New environments create energy. They force creativity. They push people out of habits. But what often gets missed is what gets lost when everything resets. When Grian joins a new SMP, the context disappears. No one really knows what to expect yet. Reactions are immediate but shallow. Everything is louder, faster, and more obvious. Hermitcraft is different because it doesn't need to introduce him anymore. Everyone already understands his tendencies. They know when he's joking. They know when something feels off. They know when a small action might turn into something bigger later. That shared understanding creates restraint, and restraint is what gives his actions weight. On a new server, chaos is cheap. You can cause it instantly. On Hermitcraft, chaos has consequences. If Grian pushes too far, it doesn't just end a bit. It changes how people treat him for the rest of the season. That feedback loop makes every decision more meaningful. It's also why his quieter moments on Hermitcraft often feel stronger than his loud ones elsewhere. When Grian does nothing for a while, people notice. When he builds something simple, people read into it. That level of attention only exists because of history. Another thing worth talking about is comfort. Comfort gets a bad reputation in creative spaces. People assume comfort leads to stagnation, but comfort can also lead to honesty. When you're comfortable, you stop performing as much. You stop trying to prove you belong. Hermitcraft is one of the few places where Grian doesn't need to perform. He's already established. That allows him to slow down without disappearing, to experiment quietly without losing relevance. On faster SMPs, slowing down often means falling behind. On Hermitcraft, slowing down can actually make your presence stronger. There's also the audience factor. Hermitcraft viewers are used to long arcs. They're patient. They don't need constant escalation to stay engaged. That gives Grian room to let ideas grow naturally instead of forcing them into content immediately. Some of his best moments come from things that weren't meant to be moments at all. They happened because he stayed long enough for small interactions to pile up. That only works in an environment where time matters. Another reason staying longer makes sense is balance. Grian isn't the center of Hermitcraft, but he is a stabilizer. When he's active, the server has a certain rhythm, not faster, not slower, just more deliberate. People play differently when they know Grian is around. They anticipate pranks, they double-check builds, they think about optics. That changes behavior across the server, even when he's not involved directly. Removing that presence shifts the tone, not instantly, but gradually. Hermitcraft, without long-term anchors, starts to feel lighter, more fragmented. That's not necessarily bad, but it is different. And if Grian leaves too early, you don't just lose a player, you lose a reference point. Something else that rarely gets mentioned is how Hermitcraft absorbs mistakes. If Grian tries something that doesn't work, it doesn't define him. The server doesn't frame it as failure, it just becomes part of the season. That safety net encourages better risks, not bigger ones, smarter ones. Risks taken for curiosity instead of attention. That's an environment where creativity matures instead of spikes. And that maturity is noticeable. You can hear it in how he talks. You can see it in how he plans. It's less about impact, more about intention. Staying longer doesn't lock Grian into a role. It lets him outgrow one. He doesn't need to reinvent himself when the space around him already supports change. That's rare. Most creators need new settings to feel refreshed. Hermitcraft manages to feel new without being new because the people change even when the world doesn't, and Grian changes with them. That's why leaving too soon feels premature. Not because there's nothing else to do, but because the most interesting phase often comes after the pressure fades, after expectations settle, after the need to impress disappears. That's when decisions become honest, and honest decisions tend to last. There's also this idea that staying longer means repeating yourself, that eventually you run out of things to say or do. But repetition only happens when the environment stays static. Hermitcraft doesn't. The world might look familiar, but the people don't stay the same. Their priorities shift. Their energy changes. Their tolerance for chaos goes up or down depending on the season. Grian reacts to that. He doesn't bring the same version of himself every time. He adjusts to the room. That's something you only notice when someone stays long enough for patterns to form. On shorter SMPs, everything happens too fast for that. You get moments, but not evolution. Hermitcraft gives space for evolution, and that matters because some creative instincts don't show up immediately. They need time, they need context. Grian's humor especially works better when it's understated, when it's not the loudest thing happening. On Hermitcraft, he can make a small decision and let it sit. Let people react on their own terms. That restraint is powerful. It trusts the audience to pay attention, and Hermitcraft audiences usually do. Another overlooked part is how leaving early reframes everything that came before. When someone exits an SMP quickly, their presence becomes a highlight reel. Moments without continuity. Staying longer turns moments into threads. It lets actions echo instead of disappear. And Grian's style benefits from echoes. A prank today makes a decision tomorrow more interesting. A joke early in the season changes how a serious moment feels later. That layering only happens with time. There's also a misconception that Hermitcraft limits creativity because of its rules or expectations. But boundaries don't reduce creativity. They shape it. When you know you can't reset everything whenever you want, you think more carefully about what you introduce, you commit. Grian committing to Hermitcraft for longer stretches gives his ideas weight. They're not experiments you can walk away from. They're choices you live with. That's where maturity shows. Not in bigger builds or louder stories, but in decisions that consider consequences beyond the current episode. And that's something Hermitcraft quietly encourages. Another reason staying longer works is that it removes urgency. Urgency pushes people to exaggerate, to escalate faster than necessary. Hermitcraft doesn't punish slowing down. It almost rewards it. When Grian slows down, his creativity doesn't vanish. It condenses. Ideas become smaller but more intentional. Those are often the ideas that last. It's also worth mentioning that Hermitcraft gives closure. Not every SMP does. Some servers end abruptly, some fade out, some reset before arcs feel complete. Hermitcraft usually lets things resolve naturally. Staying longer allows Grian to close loops instead of abandoning them. That sense of completion matters, both for the creator and the audience. It makes the experience feel whole. And when something feels whole, people remember it differently. Leaving too soon doesn't ruin anything, but it changes the texture of what remains. What's left feels unfinished. There's no rule that says Grian has to stay forever, and there shouldn't be. But staying longer, especially when there's no pressure to perform, creates a space where creativity becomes quieter and more refined. That phase is easy to miss. It doesn't generate instant clips. It doesn't dominate thumbnails. But it's often the phase people look back on later and appreciate the most. Hermitcraft gives room for that phase to exist, and Grian fits into it naturally. Not as a centerpiece, not as a constant source of chaos, but as someone who understands how time changes a server. Staying longer doesn't freeze him in place. It lets him grow without resetting. And that kind of growth is rare in Minecraft content because it requires patience from the creator and from the audience. Hermitcraft has both. That's why the idea of Grian staying longer doesn't feel limiting. It feels appropriate. Not because there's nothing else to explore, but because some of the most interesting parts only appear when you stop rushing to the next thing.